Welcome to this module of literary criticism, where we would be looking into chapter 4, wherein Coleridge describes what is fancy and imagination according to him. Fancy and imagination are two diverse and unique faculties that are derived from the Greek words fantasia and imaginatio respectively. These two words have been used synonymously in ordinary language. However, they have separate origins and hence the meanings associated with them require further study. Coleridge rejects the empiricist notion that sense impressions and external experiences undergo combinations and they are stored in the mind that is considered to be a tabula rasa. Early opinions on fancy and imagination existed. During the 17th century, the terms imagination and fancy had often been used in vague and synonymous ways to refer to the world of fairy tales or the make-believe. The 18th century witnessed a perception of imagination that moved through the stages of associationist theories. The concept of fancy assumed higher significance and it was considered to possess greater creative mental power. Imagination was associated with work where the mind was a repository of such types of work that was to carry out routine labor. The relative position of the two terms imagination and fancy in relation to their preference of usage was established by the end of the 18th century. Irrespective of the revised meanings assigned to them, it was inevitable that the superior term should be imagination. In this regard, the new critics Wimsatt and Brooks observe, I quote, "It followed that during the 18th century, whenever the distinction between imagination and fancy was being made, and it often was honors, were likely to fall on the term imagination. A certain softness and warmth and depth of good feeling grew around the term imagination. A corresponding coldness and brittleness and the suggestion of unreliable frolic invested the related but opposed term fancy." Unquote. With regard to the meaning of these two terms, where a work of faith imitated the original faithfully, it was called a work of imagination, and where the poet substituted something of his own invention that was similar with the original, it was called a work of fancy. Wordsworth, in the revised preface of 1815, assigned a higher function to both fancy and imagination and said that both were creative and not simply reproductive faculties. The difference was that imagination fused all things into one, while fancy joined them willfully. Let us now try to find out the occasion that aroused Coleridge's interest in fancy and imagination. Coleridge had taken the problem of imagination and fancy much more seriously and tried to bring out the essential difference between the two. Wordsworth aroused Coleridge's interest in differentiating the terms fancy and imagination. Wordsworth had read out a poem to Coleridge in a manuscript originally called Guilt and Sorrow. The poem made an impact on Coleridge, who wanted to analyze the reason for the profound feeling that the poem had left in his mind. He found that it was a union of deep feeling with profound thought and the balance of truth with observation, which was modified by the imaginative faculty. Coleridge observes that the differences in the styles of Milton and Cowley could be attributed to the differences in their perceptions of thought, emotions and imagination. Coleridge comments in chapter 4 of Biographia Literaria that Milton had a highly imaginative mind, but Cowley had a very fanciful mind. Let us now look into this figure, which tells you very briefly what exactly Coleridge wanted to say by imagination and fancy. Imagination is a faculty, says Coleridge, that is possessed by anybody. However, this imagination is divided into two categories, the primary and the secondary. Primary imagination is that which is possessed by anybody, a layman too. However, secondary imagination is a particular faculty possessed only by writers or those with creative faculties. The characteristics of primary imagination are it's creative, unique and unconsciously used, because each individual possesses the capacity to create impressions and unconsciously use them. Similarly, every individual possesses the capacity to produce images, which means the individual can create new images from the images that already exist in his mind. By ordering the images in his mind or by fusing several images together, he actually produces a form of image that comes to his mind from an order that he has created, which means there are several sense impressions in the mind of the individual. These sense impressions exist in a chaotic form, and it is the individual mind that orders these sense impressions to produce a whole. This could be done by anybody. However, secondary imagination is the unique poetic faculty that molds and reshapes the world. When I say it molds and reshapes the world, it means the primary imagination that helped to form images, the images just remain there as such. They do not undergo further transformation. However, under secondary imagination, the images that have been formed, they get molded, they get reshaped and something new is created. And when this new is created, it brings in a new order, which means new worlds are created. Each time a poet tries to create something out of the images that already exists in his mind, he is in the process of constructing newer worlds, where each world appears to be different from the other. This, says Coleridge, is possible only for poets or those with artistic creativity. Of course, Coleridge does not limit artistic creativity to poets alone for all art. Let us compare primary and secondary imagination with fancy. As mentioned earlier, fancy was a term that was not given primacy, mainly because it is that faculty which only blends the figures of speech in a mechanical and logical manner and forms new images, which means when the faculty called fancy is employed, no new world is created. Their processes of molding and reshaping, of forming new wholes from what already existed, does not remain. This is what he meant by saying imagination and fancy. To put it in very simple terms, imagination has higher creative potential than fancy, while imagination creates something new out of what already exists. Fancy simply bends together what already exists. Though these new images are created, these new images are in no way different from the images that existed earlier. The differences between fancy, imagination, the primary imagination and secondary imagination already given, let us find out what Coleridge had to say about fancy and imagination, probably an elaboration of the figure that we had seen earlier. The primary concern of Biographia Literaria was the distinction between fancy and imagination in the way they influenced poetry. Coleridge was fascinated with imagination and its creative potential all through his life. Hartley believed that the mind is the seat of the mechanical processes that move in an unrestricted manner, while the soul and the universe are viewed to be the confluence of particulars that do not possess any underlying spiritual unity. This view could not be accepted by Coleridge, who eventually became disillusioned with the theory, for he believed in the presence of a reality that transcended the senses. To Coleridge, ideas were realities that could be viewed by reason. In other words, the reason was a medium through which the world could be experienced. Coleridge's view of the imagination, which possesses the ability to penetrate into the ultimate truth of things, is different from the view of the German philosopher Kant. From Kant, Coleridge adopted the idea that imagination is the power that is seen in men and not restricted to a few people like poets or artists who are gifted with an extraordinary sense of imagination. Kant expressed the opinion that imagination reconciled the senses and the forms of understanding the world and the objects around. Coleridge agreed with the views of Kant, and his vision went further, for he believed that ultimate truth could be found. The imagination works at its best when it infuses emotional life into outward forms and makes them alive. In chapter 4 of Biographia Literaria, Coleridge introduces the differences between fancy and imagination. He gives a historical account of the association of ideas and compares Aristotle's theory with that of Hartley's. Though he tries to explore the differences between fancy and memory, he refrains from the effort. After some chapters, he sets forth a series of explorations and arrives at the final principle of knowledge, which is the identity of the subject and the object in I am. Later on, in chapter 13, Coleridge elaborates his definitions of fancy and of the primary and secondary imagination. The critic Shawcross explains that imagination is recognized to be universally active in consciousness, which is creative, in that it externalizes the world of objects. Imagination is a faculty which has a heightened power and possesses creativity. This means that imagination functions in two different levels, the ordinary and the extraordinary, or the poetic. Primary imagination is seen to be the common property of all men, whereby they differentiate themselves by an unconscious process from the external world of objects. The secondary imagination is reserved for the poets, and this faculty is reflected in their works. Let us elaborate fancy and imagination. According to Coleridge, fancy and imagination are two distinct as well as different faculties. Coleridge observes that Milton had a highly imaginative mind, whereas Cowley possessed a fanciful one. The distinction between fancy and imagination is the same as the difference in the meanings of delirium and mania. Coleridge provides quotes from Otway and Shakespeare to make his point. To quote Otway's lines: "Lutes, laurels, seas of milk and ships of amber." These lines tell us about fancy, whereas let us look at Shakespeare's line: What have his daughters brought him to this past is an instance of imagination. The distinction he has drawn between fancy and imagination shows his interest in psychology. Coleridge says that he is deeply interested in metaphysics and psychology. He is contented to know that he is a first among his countrymen to distinguish between fancy and imagination, examine and analyze the implications of these terms with respect to his contribution to English poetry. Coleridge has not come across Taylor's volume of synonyms. His specification of the terms fancy and imagination has been depicted as being inadequate and erroneous by Wordsworth in his preface to the Lyrical Ballads. Wordsworth's explanation of the two terms differs from that of Coleridge, chiefly because their aims seem to be different. Wordsworth's purpose was to consider the influences of fancy and imagination in the human mind because the effects they produce are different. Coleridge's intention, on the other hand, is to investigate the seminal principles and then deduce the intensity of the dissimilarities between fancy and imagination. Coleridge adds, I quote, "My friend has drawn a masterly sketch of the branches with their poetic fruitage. I wish to add the trunk and even the roots as far as they lift themselves above ground and are visible to the naked eye of our common." Unquote. This means that Wordsworth has drawn a masterly sketch of the branches with their poetic output, and Coleridge has the trunk and even the roots as far as they lift themselves above ground and are made clear to the human mind. Coleridge's theory of fancy and imagination is a cardinal aspect of his poetic belief, which is self-explanatory. However, if any obscurity is discovered in his principle, it is because it is a part of what is generally attached to a new concept. It is the duty of those who ridicule him for perversion of taste to study his notions and theories thoroughly, otherwise they should decide not to, which is creative in that it externalizes the world of objects. Imagination is a faculty which has a heightened power and possesses to make an attempt to examine his poetry and his concept of poetry. Let us now understand what Coleridge meant by the term imagination. We would be looking into a broader explanation of the term imagination. Coleridge says that imagination is the factor that unites sense impressions into an organic pattern. Coleridge does not elaborate what he means by the word organic. Primary imagination is the power of perceiving the objects of sense and to have a clear picture of them. When the mind is confronted with irregular and confused thoughts about the representation of the divine consciousness, primary imagination is that vital agency which enables the mind to perceive the unity and order that pervades God's creation. The secondary imagination, which is similar to primary imagination, is important. It is vital and performs the same function, which is the search for harmony and order within the confused state of sense impressions. The essential difference between the primary and secondary imagination is that the primary imagination is involuntary, where the mind plays a natural role, while the secondary imagination is a conscious use of this power which relies on human will. With the active participation of human inclinations, it works on the objects supplied by the primary imagination and is therefore a more active form of imagination than the primary imagination. Coleridge says that secondary imagination has the power because, I quote, it diffuses, dissolves, dissipates in order to recreate, unquote. Secondary imagination is the faculty that helps the poet in revealing the beautiful and permanent forms of nature. That is why Coleridge describes it to be a shaping spirit, a unifying and creative faculty. It performs the miracle of breaking down the barrier between mind and matter. Therefore, the secondary imagination is at the origin of all artistic creation. Imagination reveals itself in qualities that balance, oppose or reconcile the differences in artistic creativity. The primary imagination and the secondary imagination perform the same functions, that of reconciling and unifying the diverse things into one. Now, where does the difference lie? The difference between primary imagination and secondary imagination lies in the degree or extent to which the combination takes place. The primary imagination is feebler and works unconsciously, while the secondary imagination works consciously with all its force and power. Given the differences between primary and secondary imagination, let us move on to understanding what is fancy according to Coleridge. Coleridge regards fancy to be the inferior of the two terms imagination and fancy. This is because fancy is not a creative power, because it possesses only the ability to combine different things into pleasing shapes. However, it does not possess the capacity to fuse them into an entity. F. L. Lucas, in The Decline and Fall of the Romantic Ideal, explains that, I quote, fancy assembles her images. The word assembles is very important here, and arranges them unchanged themselves about her door. She makes barren images, marriages of ideas which do not, like those blessed with imagination, produce a new creation, unquote. This quote explicitly states that fancy does not possess the ability for new creativity. Fancy is the arbitrary bringing together of things that lie remote and forming them into a unity. Coleridge explains that fancy is, I quote, the faculty of bringing together images dissimilar in the main by some one point or more of likeness. It is related to the talent which is acquired, while imagination is related to genius which is innate. Coleridge explains the difference between his view of fancy and imagination and those of Wordsworth. He says that Wordsworth's purpose was to reflect on the influences of fancy and imagination as they are manifested in poetry, and from the different effects to conclude their diversity in kind. Coleridge, however, was interested to investigate the seminal principle and then find the degree from the kind. Let us move into some of the important quotes from chapter 4. It has already been hinted that metaphysics and psychology have long been my hobby horse, but to have a hobby horse and to be vain of it are so commonly found together that they pass almost for the same. This is Coleridge's quote when he wanted to say how far he considered his ideas on fancy and imagination, his interest in metaphysics, to be very important to him. But it was Wordsworth's purpose to consider the influences of fancy and imagination as they are manifested in poetry, and from the different effects to conclude their diversity in kind, while it is my object to investigate the seminal principle and then from the kind to deduce the degree. My friend has drawn a masterly sketch of the branches with their poetic fruitage. I wish to add the trunk and even the roots as far as they lift themselves above ground and are visible to the naked eye of our common consciousness. This quote was mentioned by Coleridge when he wanted to explain about the differences of opinion that they had, both Coleridge and Wordsworth, with regard to the terms fancy and imagination. Let us now move on to finding out what Coleridge wanted to say about imagination and fancy in this module with a recap. The terms imagination and fancy had often been used to mean the same during the 17th century. Often the terms were used to refer to the world of fantasy or the unreal. The 18th century gave importance to associationist theories, and imagination was defined in these terms. The concept of fancy was considered loftier and more important when compared to imagination. Coleridge adopted the idea that imagination is a faculty that is not the privileged insight of a few, but everybody, from the German philosopher Kant. Coleridge differed from Kant because he believed that the ultimate truth could be found. Coleridge says that he is deeply interested in metaphysics and psychology. He is delighted to know that he is the first among his countrymen to distinguish between fancy and imagination, and thereby provide a new understanding of the terms. The elaborations on fancy and imagination are extended to chapter 13 of Biographia Literaria, which we would be looking into in our next session. Chapter 14 discusses certain fundamental aspects of the lyrical ballads and ends with the philosophical definitions of a poem and poetry. Chapter 18 explains the differences between poetry and prose. With the summary given to you, we would be following this with a series of questions for you. Hope you would enjoy reading what Coleridge had to say about fancy and imagination. Until we meet next time for further elaboration on fancy and imagination by Coleridge, let me say bye. Thank you.